The afternoon sun hammered down on Redemption Creek like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the main street into a ribbon of shimmering heat. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings, and the few people brave enough to venture outside moved with the slow deliberation of those who knew better than to waste energy in this heat. Jackson Cole rode into town on a gray mare, his black duster already coated with the fine red dust of the Arizona Territory. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from never having truly failed at anything. His matched Colt revolvers hung low on his hips, the holsters worn smooth from practice, and his eyes swept the street with the casual arrogance of a man looking for something to prove. The First Chance Saloon stood at the center of town, its false front proclaiming ambitions the building itself couldn't quite live up to. Jackson tied his horse to the rail and pushed through the bat-wing doors, letting them swing shut behind him with a theatrical flourish. Inside, the saloon offered little relief from the heat. A handful of patrons nursed warm beers at scattered tables, and the bartender, a thick-set man in his 60s with gray mutton chops and tired eyes, wiped down the bar with mechanical precision. But Jackson's attention fixed immediately on the figure in the back corner. The old cowboy sat alone at a round table, positioned so his back was to the wall and he could see both doors. His hat was tipped forward, casting his face in shadow, and his hands rested on the table around a glass of whiskey that caught the amber light from the window. He wore a faded vest over a once white shirt and a gun belt that had seen decades of use. "That him?" Jackson asked, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "That's the warden?" The bartender, whose name was Samuel Hodges, set down his rag with deliberate care. "Son, maybe you should—" "I asked you a question, old man." Jackson's voice carried the sharp edge of youth and impatience. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "That's him. Been sitting there since this morning. Now, if you're smart—" "Smart?" Jackson laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "I didn't ride 300 miles to be smart. I rode here to face the man who's supposed to be the fastest gun in the territory." He crossed the floor with purposeful strides, his spurs jingling with each step. The other patrons found sudden interest in their drinks, their bodies angling away, as if distance might protect them from what was coming. Jackson stopped directly in front of the warden's table, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "You hear me, old man? I'm calling you out. Jackson Cole is my name, and I'm faster than you ever were, even in your prime." The warden didn't move, didn't so much as twitch. "Hey!" Jackson's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the whiskey glass. "I'm talking to you." Still, nothing. The figure remained perfectly still, that shadowed face pointed downward, as if the warden had fallen asleep sitting up. "What's the matter?" "The great warden, too scared to even look at me." Jackson's voice rose, cracking slightly with frustration. "Or maybe you're just too old and drunk to care anymore." Samuel cleared his throat from behind the bar. "Cole, I think you should—" "Shut up!" Jackson snapped. He leaned forward, reaching out to knock the warden's hat back. "I said I'm—" His words died in his throat. As the hat tilted back, the afternoon light fell across the warden's face, and Jackson Cole felt ice water flood his veins, despite the oppressive heat. The eyes that should have been sizing him up, calculating angles and distance, were instead fixed and glassy. The weathered face held no expression at all, frozen in whatever moment had been his last. The lips, slightly parted, had the blue-gray tinge that no amount of Arizona sun could warm. Jackson stumbled backward, his hand instinctively going to his gun before falling away uselessly. He's dead," Samuel finished quietly from the bar. "Been dead since sometime last night, near as I can figure. Maybe longer." The word hung in the air like the dust motes caught in the sunlight. Around the room, the other patrons remained frozen, waiting to see what the young gunslinger would do with this revelation. Jackson Cole had ridden 300 miles to face a legend. He'd prepared speeches, practiced his draw until his hands blistered, imagined the glory that would come from outdrawing the warden in front of witnesses. He'd built his entire future on this moment, and he'd challenged a dead man. Jackson stood rooted to the floorboards, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. The silence in the saloon had quality to it now, not the absence of sound, but the presence of judgment. Every eye in the room was on him, watching how he would handle the collapse of his carefully constructed moment of glory. "How long?" Jackson's voice came out rougher than he intended. "How long has he been sitting there?" Samuel moved from behind the bar with the slow, careful movements of a man approaching a spooked horse. "Found him like that when I opened this morning. Figured he'd dozed off at first. Wouldn't be the first time. But when he didn't move by mid-morning, he shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. Seemed wrong to disturb him. This was his place, his table. Man's got a right to die where he lived. You just left him there. Jackson's voice climbed with disbelief. You opened for business with a dead man in the corner? What would you have had me do? Samuel's tired eyes held no apology. The warden kept the peace in this town for 23 years. Every drunk cowboy, every range war brewing, every hothead looking to prove something. He stopped it all. Not with his gun, mind you. Not in the later years. Just by being here. By being him. Seemed to me he'd earned the right to a few more hours of peace before the world came calling. A man in the corner, weathered and grey like ancient driftwood, spoke up for the first time. His voice was soft, but it carried. Besides, boy, you weren't the first to challenge him today. Jackson spun. What? Young fellow rode in at dawn, the old man continued, seeming to speak to his beer more than to Jackson. Couldn't have been more than 20. Called himself the Amarillo Kid or some such foolishness. Stood right where you're standing now, talking loud about how he was going to make his reputation. The warden didn't answer him either. Kid worked himself up into a real fury, threatened to shoot him where he sat if he didn't stand up and face him proper. The saloon had gone completely still now. Even the flies seemed to have stopped buzzing. And? Jackson prompted, though part of him didn't want to know. Kid drew his gun, the old man said simply. Pointed it right at the warden's head, hand shaking so bad I thought he might shoot by accident. Stood there for maybe 2 minutes, which is a hell of a long time when you're aiming a gun at a man. Then he started crying. Holstered his piece, walked out and rode away. Haven't seen a man look so broken since the war. Jackson felt something cold settling in his stomach. He knew? The kid knew the warden was dead? Knew, suspected, couldn't tell. Does it matter? Samuel had reached the warden's table now. With surprising gentleness, he straightened the dead man's hat, adjusting it to shade that frozen face once more. What he knew was that he couldn't shoot a man who wouldn't fight back. Not even a dead one. That's what separates the gunslingers from the murderers, son. The warden taught us that. This is insane. Jackson's voice had lost its swagger, replaced by something younger, more uncertain. You can't just leave him here. There's got to be an undertaker, a sheriff. Someone. Sheriff died 4 years ago. A woman's voice cut in from the doorway. Jackson turned to see a figure silhouetted against the harsh sunlight. As she stepped inside, he made out a woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a simple grey dress that had seen better days. Her face was pretty but hard set, as if she'd learned not to trust anything that came easy. As for the undertaker, that would be Doc Morrison, and he's been drunk in his office since yesterday afternoon. Seems he took the warden's passing particularly hard. Who are you? Jackson asked. Margaret Porter. I run the boarding house down the street. She moved past Jackson without looking at him, her attention fixed on the figure at the corner table. When she reached Samuel's side, her expression softened. Has he been like this all day, Sam? Yes, ma'am. Couldn't bring myself to move him. Felt wrong somehow. Margaret nodded slowly, then did something that made Jackson's chest tighten. She reached out and took the warden's cold, stiff hand in hers, holding it with a familiarity that spoke of old friendship, or perhaps something more. You stubborn old fool, she whispered. Couldn't even die in a bed like a normal person. Had to be here, didn't you? At your post until the very end. Did you know him well? Jackson found himself asking, his voice stripped of bravado. Margaret's laugh was short and bitter. Know him? Everyone in Redemption Creek knew the warden, Mr. Cole. That was the problem. Everyone knew the legend. Very few knew the man. She released the dead hand gently, arranging it back on the table just as it had been. His real name was Thomas Ward. He came here in 1860, just another gun for hire during the range wars. But somewhere along the way he decided there had to be a better path than bleeding the range dry, one bullet at a time. She turned to face Jackson fully now, and he saw tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Do you know what real power is, Mr. Cole? It's not how fast you can draw or how many notches you have on your gun. Real power is making men choose peace when everything in them is screaming for violence. That's what Thomas Ward did. He made this town believe in something better than itself. But he's dead now, Jackson said, and immediately regretted the words when he saw Margaret flinch. Yes, she agreed quietly. He's dead. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Jackson blinked. Me? What am I supposed to do? I didn't know him. I just came here to challenge him, Margaret finished. To build your reputation on his back. Well, congratulations, Mr. Cole. You've got everyone's attention now. The whole town will be talking about how Jackson Cole rode into Redemption Creek and challenged a dead man. Her voice had turned to steel. Is that the legacy you wanted? The words hit harder than any fist could have. Jackson looked around the saloon, at Samuel's disappointed eyes, at the old man in the corner who watched him with something like pity, at the other patrons who had witnessed his grand entrance and greater humiliation. I didn't know, he said weakly. No, Margaret agreed. You didn't, but you know now, and that means you have to decide what kind of man you're going to be. The kind who rides away and lets Thomas Ward's death become just another piece of gossip, or the kind who might understand why a man deserves better. Before Jackson could answer, the saloon doors burst open with enough force to slam them against the walls. A boy, couldn't have been more than 14, stood in the doorway, chest heaving from running, his face flushed and streaked with tears. Ma, he gasped, his eyes finding Margaret. Ma, there's riders coming. A lot of them. Billy Creed and his whole gang, and they're saying— His voice broke. They're saying with the warden dead, Redemption Creek belongs to them now. The boy's words hung in the air like gun smoke. Margaret's face went pale, then hardened into something that reminded Jackson of forged iron, brittle on the surface but unbreakable underneath. How many, David? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear Jackson could see in her eyes. 12, maybe 15, the boy gasped. They stopped at the edge of town, watering their horses. Billy's telling everyone who'll listen that he's been waiting years for this day. Says the warden was the only thing keeping him from taking what's rightfully his. Samuel moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass toward the east end of town. Son of a bitch. I'd hoped we'd have more time before the vultures started circling. Who's Billy Creed? Jackson asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Everything Thomas Ward wasn't, Margaret said bitterly. She moved to her son, placing her hands on his shoulders. David, I want you to go to the boarding house. Take the back streets. Get everyone inside and bar the doors, understand? But Ma— Now, David. Her tone left no room for argument. The boy cast one last look at the corner table, where the warden sat in eternal silence, then disappeared back into the brutal afternoon heat. Margaret watched him go. Her jaw clenched so tight Jackson could see the muscles jumping. Billy Creed, Samuel said from the window, his voice heavy with old grudges, was one of the guns for hire during the range wars. He and his brother Jake ran protection rackets, claim-jumped small homesteaders, and left a trail of bodies from here to New Mexico. Thomas stopped them cold in '68, killed Jake in a fair fight after Jake murdered a Mexican family for their water rights. Billy swore revenge, but Thomas's reputation kept him at bay. Without Thomas— He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Without Thomas, there's nothing stopping him, Margaret finished. She turned to Jackson, and he found himself unable to look away from those hard, measuring eyes. You wanted to face a legend, Mr. Cole. Well, here's your chance. Billy Creed and his men are about to ride down Main Street. They'll take what they want. Money, supplies, probably worse. And there's no one to stop them. Jackson felt his throat go dry. I'm just one man. You said there's 12 or 15 of them. Then run, the old man in the corner said quietly. Your horse is right outside. You could be gone before they even know you were here. Smart play, really. Live to build your reputation another day. The words were spoken without judgment, but Jackson felt them like a brand. He looked at the warden's still form, at the weathered hands that had stopped more violence with their mere presence than most men could with an army. 23 years of keeping the peace. 23 years of standing between the wolves and the sheep. There has to be a way to stop them without a shootout, Jackson heard himself say. That's what the warden would have done, right? Found another way. Thomas had time to build his reputation, Samuel said, moving away from the window. He had years to become the legend that kept men like Billy in check. We don't have years, son. We have maybe 10 minutes before they ride in. Margaret crossed to the bar, reaching underneath to pull out a Winchester rifle. She checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, then grabbed a box of ammunition. Sam, get everyone out of here. No point in having witnesses if this goes bad. Mr. Cole, you should go too. This isn't your fight. Wait, Jackson said, an idea forming in his mind. Crazy, desperate, but maybe the only chance they had. What if it doesn't have to be a fight at all? They both turned to look at him. Billy Creed is coming here for revenge, right? He wants to prove that without the warden, he's the top gun. But what if— Jackson swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. What if the warden is still here? Samuel's eyes narrowed. Boy, I don't know what you're suggesting, but Billy doesn't know Thomas is dead, does he? He's heard rumors, probably, but he hasn't seen for himself. If he rides in and sees the warden sitting right there at his table, same as always. Jackson's words were coming faster now, fueled by desperation and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. Billy's a bully and a coward. That's why he waited all these years. He's scared of the warden, or at least of what the warden represents. You want to prop up a dead man like some kind of scarecrow? Margaret's voice was incredulous. That's your plan. It'll buy time, Jackson insisted. Time for the town to prepare, time to get people to safety, time to send for a real marshal. And if Billy does figure it out, he rested his hand on his revolver, the leather of the grip suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. Well, then at least we tried it the warden's way first. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down like the afternoon heat. Outside, Jackson could hear the sound of approaching horses, the jingle of tack and spurs, the rough laughter of men who thought they'd finally been unchained. It's insane, Samuel said finally. It's disrespectful, Margaret added, but her voice lacked conviction. It's what we've got, Jackson said. Samuel looked at Margaret, and something unspoken passed between them, the kind of communication that came from years of shared hardship. Finally, Margaret lowered the Winchester. If we're going to do this, she said, we do it right. Sam, adjust his hat forward more. We need his face completely in shadow. Mr. Cole, you stand next to that table like you're having a conversation with him. Keep your body between Billy's line of sight and Thomas's face if you can. What about you? Jackson asked. I'll be behind the bar with the rifle, just in case your miracle doesn't pan out. She moved to her position, the weapon held with the casual competence of someone who'd used it before. Sam, get everyone else out the back. Now. The old bartender moved quickly, ushering the remaining patrons toward the rear exit with urgent whispers. The old man from the corner paused as he passed Jackson, gripping his arm with surprising strength. You're either the bravest fool I've ever met or the biggest coward, he said quietly. Time will tell which. Then he was gone, leaving Jackson alone with Margaret and the silent witness in the corner. Jackson positioned himself next to the warden's table, trying to angle his body naturally while still blocking the view of Thomas Ward's death-frozen face. His hand rested on the table, inches from that cold, stiff hand, and he found himself wishing he'd paid more attention to the old stories about the warden, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the subtle gestures that had convinced so many violent men to choose peace. The sound of horses stopped outside. Boots hit the dusty street with deliberate heaviness. Jackson could hear them coming before he could see them, the creak of leather, the metallic click of spurs, the low murmur of men working themselves up for violence. The batwing doors exploded inward. Billy Creed was not what Jackson expected. The years had been unkind. His once powerful frame had run to fat, and his face bore the bloated, red-veined look of a man who'd spent too many nights with a whiskey bottle. But his eyes were sharp and mean, and the matched silver-plated revolvers on his hips were well-maintained tools of a professional killer. Behind him crowded 6 other men, and Jackson could see more shadows lingering outside, their silhouettes dark against the bright doorway. Well, well, Billy drawled, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a rattlesnake's warning. The First Chance Saloon. How fitting that this is where it all ends. Jackson's heart hammered so hard, he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He forced himself to remain still, leaning against the warden's table with what he hoped looked like casual confidence, rather than the terror-driven paralysis it actually was. Billy's eyes swept the empty saloon, and Jackson saw the moment they landed on the corner table, on the warden's shadowed form, still and silent. The outlaw's swagger faltered, just for a heartbeat, before he caught himself. Thomas Ward, Billy said, and despite his bravado, there was an edge to his voice. Been a long time. The warden didn't respond, didn't move. The whiskey glass sat untouched before him, catching the light like amber frozen in time. Cat, got your tongue, old man? Billy took a step closer, and his men fanned out behind him, hands drifting toward their weapons. Or maybe you finally realized that your time's done, that this town's protection just expired. Jackson knew he had to say something, had to play the role he'd assigned himself, but his throat had gone bone dry. He was acutely aware of the warden's corpse beside him, of Margaret's rifle behind the bar, of the 6 guns pointed in his general direction. "The warden's busy," Jackson heard himself say, his voice steadier than he felt. "You boys should come back another time." Every eye in the room swung to him. Billy's face split into a grin that had nothing to do with humor. "And who the hell are you, boy? The warden's new lapdog?" "Just a friend," Jackson said, his hand drifting closer to his revolver. "And the message stands. Come back another time." "I don't think so." Billy's hand hovered over his silver-plated Colt. "See, I rode a long way for this conversation. Been waiting 17 years to look Thomas Ward in the eye and tell him that everything he did, every man he killed, every threat he made, it was all for nothing. Jake's death was for nothing. This whole town's faith in him was for nothing." He took another step forward, and Jackson could smell the whiskey and sweat rolling off him in waves. "So I'm not leaving until the great warden looks me in the eye and admits that I won, that I outlasted him." The moment stretched like hot taffy. Jackson's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in blood and bullets. Behind the bar, he could sense Margaret tensing, her finger probably tightening on the Winchester's trigger. The men behind Billy were coiled springs waiting for violence. And then the warden's hat moved. It was so slight that Jackson almost missed it, just a small shift as if the dead man had tilted his head slightly. But Billy saw it. His face went pale, and his hand jerked away from his gun as if burned. "You got something to say to me, old man?" Billy's voice cracked, years of fear and hatred bleeding through the false confidence. "After all this time, you got something to say?" Jackson's breath caught as he realized what had happened. A breeze through the broken window, nothing more, had shifted the warden's hat. But in that movement, Billy Creed had seen a ghost, had seen the legend that had haunted his nightmares for 17 years. "He doesn't need to say anything," Jackson said quietly, finding his voice again. He straightened, putting his body fully between Billy and the warden. "You already know what he'd tell you. The same thing he's been telling men like you for 23 years. There's always another way. Violence isn't strength. It's surrender. It's admitting you don't have the courage to be better." "The hell do you know about courage?" Billy snarled, but there was desperation in his voice now. "You're just some kid playing dress-up in a dead man's shadow." "Maybe," Jackson agreed, "but I know what I'm looking at. I see a man who's spent 17 years building himself up for this moment, convincing himself that revenge would fill whatever hole Jake's death left behind. But it won't, will it? Killing the warden, even if you could, won't bring your brother back, won't make you feel any less empty." "Shut up." Billy's hand found his gun again, but his fingers trembled. "You don't know anything about me or Jake." "I know Jake murdered a family," Jackson said, and he could feel Margaret's eyes on him from behind the bar, could sense her silent plea for him to stop pushing. But something had taken hold of him now. Maybe the same thing that had driven Thomas Ward all those years. The understanding that some battles had to be fought with words instead of bullets. "I know he died because he chose violence over humanity. And I know the warden gave him every chance to walk away before it came to that. My brother was defending what was ours. Your brother was a murderer." Jackson's voice was hard now, channeling every ounce of authority he could muster. "And the only reason you're still alive is because the warden believed even men like you could choose differently. So prove him right. Take your men and leave Redemption Creek in peace." "Or what?" Billy laughed, but it was the laugh of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "You'll outdraw all 7 of us? You and the silent old man in the corner?" "No," Margaret's voice rang out from behind the bar, strong and clear. Jackson glanced back to see her standing tall, the Winchester shouldered and aimed. "But you'll have to go through every person in this town who Thomas Ward protected, every family he kept safe, every child who grew up without fear because he was here." As if summoned by her words, the saloon doors opened again. The old man from the corner stood there, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Behind him, Jackson could see more townspeople gathering, men, women, even a few older teenagers, all armed, all watching with the grim determination of people defending their home. "That's Doc Morrison," Margaret said quietly. "Took him a while to sober up, but he's here now, and behind him is half of Redemption Creek. You want this town, Billy? You'll have to kill every last one of us. And even if you manage that, the legend of what happened here will follow you for the rest of your days. Men will remember that Billy Creed needed 15 guns to take what one man held with nothing but his reputation." Billy's face cycled through emotions, rage, fear, calculation, and finally something that might have been defeat. His eyes kept darting back to the warden's shadowed form, as if expecting the legend to rise up and strike him down. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," Jackson said softly, "it is. Because you're going to walk out that door, get on your horse, and ride away. Not because you're afraid of dying. Men like you stopped fearing death years ago, but because somewhere deep down you know your brother got what he deserved, and you're tired of carrying that weight." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the saloon's old wood settling, and the distant whisper of wind through the broken window. Billy's hand trembled over his gun, his face contorted with years of hate and grief and rage. Then his hand fell away. "You're not worth it," he spat, though everyone in the room knew the words were meant for himself as much as anyone else. "None of this godforsaken town is worth it." He turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, his men scrambling to follow. At the threshold he paused and looked back one final time at the corner table. "Rot in hell, Thomas Ward," he said quietly. Then he was gone, and the sound of horses fading into the distance was the sweetest music Jackson had ever heard. The saloon remained frozen for a long moment after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Jackson felt his legs turn to water, and he had to grip the warden's table to keep from collapsing. His hands were shaking so badly that the wood rattled under his fingers. Margaret lowered the Winchester slowly, her face pale but composed. Doc Morrison entered first, followed by a stream of townspeople, shopkeepers, ranch hands, the blacksmith still wearing his leather apron, women in simple dresses with children clutching their skirts. They filled the saloon with a strange, reverent silence, all eyes turning toward the corner table. "Is he really?" Doc Morrison asked, his voice rough from whiskey and grief. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the careful movements of someone fighting through a hangover. His medical bag hung from one hand, though everyone knew it was far too late for a doctor's services. "Since last night, we think," Samuel said quietly. "Found him this morning, sitting just like that." Doc Morrison approached the table, and Jackson stepped aside to let him pass. The doctor's hands were steadier than Jackson expected as he reached out to check for a pulse that everyone knew wouldn't be there. After a moment, he withdrew his hand and removed the warden's hat completely. In the full light, Thomas Ward's face was revealed to the town he'd protected for over 2 decades. Death had softened the hard lines that life had carved there, and Jackson could see what the man must have looked like before the weight of violence and responsibility had marked him. There was a strange peace in that weathered face, as if Thomas Ward had finally laid down a burden he'd carried for far too long. "Heart, most likely," Doc Morrison said, his professional voice cracking slightly. "He'd been having pains for months. I told him to rest, to take it easy. But Thomas," he shook his head, "Thomas said a man like him didn't get to retire. Said the moment he stopped being the warden, all the wolves he'd kept at bay would come running." "He was right," Margaret said softly. She'd moved from behind the bar and now stood at the edge of the crowd, her son David pressed against her side. Billy Creed came within an hour of word spreading. "But he left," David said, his young voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. The warden stopped him even after. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "No," Jackson found himself saying. All eyes turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "The warden didn't stop Billy Creed. You all did. Every person who picked up a weapon and stood in that doorway, that's what stopped him. That's what Thomas Ward built here. Not fear of one man's gun, but a town that learned to defend itself, to stand together." An old woman near the back, her face weathered like ancient leather, spoke up. "You're the one who challenged him, aren't you? The young gunslinger everyone was talking about?" Jackson felt his face burn with shame. "Yes, ma'am. I rode in here looking to make my reputation by outdrawing a legend. I was a fool." "Yes, you were," she agreed bluntly, but her eyes weren't unkind. "But you stood between Billy Creed and Thomas Ward's body when you could have run. You tried to do things the way Thomas would have done them. That counts for something, does it?" Jackson looked down at his hands, still trembling with aftermath adrenaline. "I built my whole life around being fast with a gun, practiced until my hands bled, dreamed about the day someone would speak my name with respect. But standing here looking at him," he gestured to the warden's still form, "I realize I don't even know what I was chasing. Was I trying to be respected, or just feared?" Samuel moved to stand beside Thomas Ward, one weathered hand resting on his old friend's shoulder. "The difference between respect and fear is why Thomas Ward became the warden, and Billy Creed became what he is. Fear is quick and easy. Any man with a gun can inspire it. But respect, that takes time. Takes choosing the harder path over and over until people believe you'll always choose it. Thomas wasn't always the warden, Margaret added. She'd moved closer now, and Jackson could see tears tracking down her face. When he first came to Redemption Creek, he was just another gun for hire. Fast, dangerous, and headed down the same road as 1,000 other violent men. But something changed him. He saw what this territory could become if someone was willing to stand in the gap between the violence and the future. What changed him? Jackson asked. Margaret smiled sadly. A woman named Sarah, my sister. She ran the boarding house before me, and she saw something in Thomas that he didn't see in himself. She told him that being fast with a gun was easy. Any fool could kill. The real challenge was being strong enough to not kill, to find another way. What happened to her? Cholera in 71. Thomas held her hand while she died, promising he'd keep protecting this town the way she'd protected him, by believing in something better. Margaret wiped at her eyes. He kept that promise for 14 years after she was gone. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the heavy expectation of violence, but the quiet reverence of grief, shared among people who'd lost someone important. Jackson felt something shifting inside him, like a wall he'd built around himself was finally cracking. I don't know how to be that kind of man, he admitted quietly. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've made myself. A gun for hire, a reputation waiting to be built. Doc Morrison had been working quietly, closing Thomas Ward's eyes with gentle fingers and folding his hands properly. Now he looked up at Jackson with the keen assessment of a man who'd spent his life diagnosing ailments. Then you have two choices, son. You can ride out of here and keep being what you've always been, or you can stay and learn to be something different. Stay? Jackson blinked in surprise. Why would you want me to stay? Because Thomas is dead, Samuel said bluntly. And whether we like it or not, Redemption Creek just lost its shield. Billy Creed backed down today, but he'll talk to other men. Word will spread that the warden is gone, and when it does, every two-bit outlaw and range boss with an axe to grind will see this town as easy pickings. You need a new warden, Jackson said slowly, understanding dawning. We need someone who can be what Thomas was, Margaret corrected. Not another gunslinger using fear to keep the peace. We need someone willing to learn how to do it right, to protect without becoming the thing we need protection from. Jackson looked around at the faces surrounding him, these people who'd stood up to Billy Creed despite their fear, who'd raised weapons in defense of their home, despite knowing they were outgunned. He thought about the warden's 23 years of choosing the harder path, of finding ways to stop violence without feeding it. I don't know if I can be that, he said honestly. Neither did Thomas, Margaret replied, but he tried. Every day for 23 years he tried, and most days he succeeded. That's all we're asking, that you try. David pulled away from his mother and approached Jackson with the fearless curiosity of youth. Are you really fast with a gun like they say? Jackson knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. Yeah, I'm fast, probably one of the fastest you'll ever meet. Then why didn't you shoot Billy Creed? You could have taken him, couldn't you? The question hung in the air, and Jackson found himself thinking about the moment in the saloon, his hand hovering over his revolver, calculating angles and odds like he'd done 1,000 times before. He could have drawn. Might have even taken Billy down before the man could react. But then what? A gunfight with 6 other armed men? A massacre that would have left bodies scattered across the saloon floor? Because being fast isn't the same as being right, Jackson said finally. The warden taught me that today. Even though he couldn't say a word, he taught me that some fights you win by not fighting at all. David seemed to consider this, his young face serious. My ma says violence is like a fever. Once it starts, it's hard to stop. She says that's why Mr. Ward was so important. He knew how to break the fever before it spread. Your ma's a smart woman. I know, David said with the simple certainty of a child. Then more quietly, are you going to leave like Billy Creed did? Jackson looked up at Margaret, at Samuel, at Doc Morrison and the old woman, and all the other faces watching him with a mixture of hope and wariness. He thought about his horse tied up outside, his saddlebags packed with everything he owned. He could be gone within an hour, back to the life he'd planned, drifting from town to town, challenge to challenge, building a reputation one bullet at a time. Or he could stay, could try to be something he'd never imagined being, could try to fill boots that seemed impossibly large. No, he heard himself say, I'm not leaving. Not yet, anyway. The tension in the room broke like a fever. just as David had described. People began moving again, talking in low voices, making plans. Doc Morrison took charge of preparing Thomas Ward's body for burial. Samuel started organizing watches, people who would keep eyes on the roads in case Billy Creed changed his mind. Margaret began coordinating food and supplies, turning the boarding house into a temporary headquarters. Jackson watched it all unfold, this town that had learned to protect itself, and he realized that the warden's real legacy wasn't fear or reputation, it was this, a community that knew how to stand together, that believed in something beyond violence. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows through the saloon's dusty windows, Samuel approached Jackson with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. They stood together by the warden's table, and Samuel poured them each a measure. "To Thomas Ward," Samuel said, raising his glass, "who taught us that the fastest draw isn't always the best draw." "To the warden," Jackson echoed, and they drank. The whiskey burned, going down, sharp and real and alive. Jackson set his glass on the table next to the one Thomas Ward would never finish, and made himself a promise. He didn't know if he could be what this town needed. Didn't know if he had it in him to choose peace over violence day after day, year after year, the way Thomas Ward had. But he knew he had to try, because somewhere in the Arizona dust, riding away with his tail between his legs, Billy Creed was already telling stories. Stories about how the warden had faced him down one last time, even from beyond death. Stories about how Redemption Creek was still protected, still defended, still standing. And maybe, Jackson thought, if he told those stories long enough and loud enough, other men like him, other young gunslingers looking for easy reputation, would think twice before riding in, would remember that some legends didn't die with the men who built them. The sun set on Redemption Creek, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Tomorrow they would bury Thomas Ward with full honors, and the day after that, Jackson Cole would begin learning how to be something more than just a fast gun. But tonight, as the last light faded from the windows of the First Chance Saloon, Jackson stood watch over the man who taught him, without speaking a single word, that true courage wasn't about how quickly you could draw your weapon, but how long you could keep it holstered. The warden was dead. But the peace he'd fought for still lived, carried forward by the hands of those he'd protected, and that, Jackson was beginning to understand, was the only legacy that really mattered. Outside, the desert wind whispered through Redemption Creek, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the choices yet to be made. Jackson Cole stood in the doorway of the saloon, his hand resting lightly on his revolver, no longer a tool for building reputation, but a last resort for protecting something worth more than any legend. The town slept. The watch was set, and somewhere in the darkness the ghost of Thomas Ward rested easy, his work finally done.